Happy Friday and welcome to another episode of Brain Scratch. I'm John Lorden. Thank you so much for joining me today as we look into another mystery, and one that has conditions that I don't believe I have seen before, and a condition that highlights maybe a bit of a flaw in terms of a system that we all know and love. I'm talking about NamUs. Now, the principles of NamUs are fairly simple. If you have a giant database of all the missing persons, active missing persons cases, and you have another database of unidentified bodies that have been found, essentially, you would have a lot of the pieces that you need to solve at least all of the unidentified bodies, because obviously not all missing persons cases are people that have passed away. But theoretically, all of those unidentified, the John and Jane Does, should be able to line up to a missing persons record. This case throws a pretty serious wrinkle at that. And on top of that is challenged a little bit just because of its age and a conclusion that, while it seemed right at the time, maybe wasn't. Let's get into the details here, starting at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. This page has been removed from their website, so I have pulled it back from Web Archive so we could look at this and get the details together. Unidentified. Jane Altoona Doe, 1984. We can see they have a rendering of what she may have looked like, and she, of course, was found in Altoona, Florida. On April 18th, 1984, an unidentified white female was found off a dirt road in the Lake Door recreation area of Ocala National Forest. She had been deceased 2 to 4 weeks before being found. She's estimated to be between 17 to 20 years old, 5 feet to 5 feet 1 inch tall, and approximately 100 pounds. The female's hair was light brown, fine, and straight. Her left ear was pierced, but she was not wearing an earring. It's unknown if her right ear was also pierced. So that's definitely giving us some insight in terms of the remains that they're dealing with. It seems like they are not completely skeletonized, but obviously they're not complete as well. And looking into this, I do know that it was a hiker that found her, and the way he described it, her remains had been scattered by wildlife. She may have broken ribs that healed during her lifetime. She was missing 2 upper teeth. Some of her remaining teeth were discolored reddish purple. Her fingernails were painted coral and orange color. The female was wearing Wrangler blue jeans, waist 24 inches, a long t-shirt with printed flowers, and the words, "Have you kissed your child tonight?" on the front. Interesting. A black t-shirt with "Here Comes Trouble," and tan canvas slip-on shoes with blue trim. Digital recreated images of the shoes in one of the t-shirts is featured. The female also wore a 15-inch metal necklace chain. At the time of the initial investigation, detectives were told the female was new to the area, possibly came from California, and was using the name Judy. As a matter of fact, in several other places, you will see her as referred to as Judy Doe. So a lot of details there, and I did mention this is what the jeans, the Wrangler jeans, would have looked like. The shirt with "Here Comes Trouble," and several other photos hosted here at the Doe Network, including some recreations that they did back at the time. We can see artist renderings and even a clay recreation that they did, likely based off her skull. Looks like they might have done one clay recreation, but then kind of put different wigs on it to give you different looks. We can see the shoes here, and this shirt is just kind of interesting to me. I don't know. Does this strike you guys as something that I guess it's made for a mother, obviously, but just the cut and the look of it to me, I don't know what to think about it. It feels like something that you would kind of more have for a child, possibly, but the message doesn't make sense for that. Of course, we are talking, 1980s in terms of fashion with this as well. The victim was located in a wooded area alongside a footpath off a dirt road approximately 3 miles north of Highway 42 and approximately a quarter mile east of Highway 19 in the Lake Door recreation area in Ocala National Forest. Let's go ahead and pull up a map so I can show you guys where this is at. And basically that intersection they're mentioning, the 19 and 42, is what's pinned here. It's highlighted. And 3 miles north, and then about a quarter mile east of the 19 would put it right around here, right around this Lake Door campground. And if we kick on the layers here, we can see we've got a lot of lush vegetation here. And when you do have an entry in NamUs for an unidentified body, they will note when there are exclusions. But for this particular case, we could see just on this page, we've got 4 rule outs. There's a second page. We've got another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They're considering people from all kinds of different states. So numerous rule outs that would happen against that case, but it wouldn't be solved until recently, until 2024. This from the Lake County Sheriff's Office. Lake County Sheriff's Office detectives identify Judy Doe in 1984 cold case. This case has been listed as a cold case by the Lake County Sheriff's Office and has been reviewed and investigated by numerous detectives for over 40 years. Multiple efforts were made to identify the remains based off of skeletal recreations, dental records, and DNA. All of these efforts unsuccessful. In November of 2023, the Lake County Sheriff's Office contacted Othram, a private laboratory that specializes in forensic genetic genealogy, in an attempt to provide new leads or information. Over a year was spent working through the genealogy of Judy Doe, and possible family members were identified. Detectives contacted these suspected family members in an attempt to gather information and obtain samples to further the genealogical testing. In November of 2024, detectives were able to make contact with a suspected close relative of Judy Doe. The cooperation of the family member led to them submitting DNA for comparison. The DNA was sent to Othram for analysis. In December 2024, Othram verified, look how fast that is, guys, 1 month. Othram verified that Judy Doe was the sister of the family member and that Judy Doe's real name is Rebecca Sue Hill. Detectives have been able to establish that Rebecca has been missing from Arkansas since sometime in 1981, which would make her 16 or 17 years old at the time of her disappearance. All right, so up to this point, this sounds like a pretty typical solve, an amazing job, again, done by Othram. But in terms of an unidentified decedent, this is kind of typically how we're seeing them go nowadays. Here's where we get into that unique condition. Rebecca was not in any database as missing. We've heard that before, but not this next part. Due to remains being found in Little Rock, Arkansas, and misidentified as Rebecca by a family member sometime in 1981 or 1982. Contact has been made with the Little Rock Police Department regarding our findings. Now, just take a moment and let that sink in. So, unfortunately, we're not at a place where every law enforcement agency in the country is they're being asked to, but they're not being tasked with putting their entries in NamUs. NamUs is not a perfect system, basically, until that happens. So, having a missing persons record not wind up in a database for an active missing persons case, that's still just a typical kind of thing that we run into with these cases. In this case, there was no shot of that happening because the case was literally closed. The family looked at some remains and said, yes, that is Rebecca. And that closed out that case. But think of the reality of what happened there. Basically, remains were found for someone else. So what does that mean? That means that someone else is now an unidentified decedent. And what has happened to those remains, I don't know. I actually sent an email to a couple friends that I have at Othram. I have not heard back from them yet. If I do hear from them, I'll put a comment and pin it to the top of the list down below. Because I was just curious about, what are this? First of all, I wanted to know, is Othram going to help in that case too? And do they need fundraising for it? Because I was going to ask you guys to help me with that. But outside of all that, I don't know what happened in terms of those original remains. We know they're scattered. We know they're at least partially skeletonized. So there's a huge question here in terms of, were they buried or were they cremated? And if they were cremated, that's going to make things really, really tough for trying to help that case. If they were buried, there's a whole other offshoot of this story that could potentially happen. But outside of all that, there's the reality of you have a family that grieves a loss, a sister, a daughter, and she was probably still alive at that time. We know based on what we're hearing about Judy Doe that she had only died 2 to 4 weeks before her body was found in April of 1984. So this family coming to this conclusion, processing this loss, going through all that is likely happened when Rebecca was actually still alive. I have looked at several web sleuths threads about this. Numerous people have been reaching out to the Little Rock Police Department trying to get some level of understanding about what's going on with that part of the investigation as well. Looks like none of us are really having any luck on that front. I'm curious just to know what's the status of those remains, because if there is some bone left, if Othram can get involved, that case will get solved too. What an amazing thing to be able to say. I'm so thankful for them. But let's go ahead and continue with the coverage here. Detectives are continuing to investigate the circumstances of Rebecca's disappearance and death. Her death is a suspected homicide, and it's the hope of the Lake County Sheriff's Office to bring the investigation to a resolution. So, not a natural death. They do think and that adds another leg to this story, of course, as well. Now we're looking for the killer of Rebecca Sue Hill. Let's jump over to DNAsolves.com. Of course, the website owned and run by Othram that kind of handles their fundraising efforts. Just get a little more detail here. The DNA profile of a potential relative was compared to Judy Doe's DNA profile using KinSNP rapid relationship testing. Now, I went to Othram last year for kind of a deep dive into their technology, a tour through their facilities. I got to spend time with the owners. It's one of the more memorable trips that I've had, especially in terms of just, my mind was blown at the level of attention to detail that is going on in that lab. But I have not heard of this product before, KinSNP rapid relationship testing. So I wanted to learn just a little bit more about it. Let's do a quick jump over to Othram.com. KinSNP enables rapid confirmation or exclusion of candidate relationships between an unknown subject and potential relatives in support of forensic genetic genealogy applications. The entire process is performed offline, and there is no interaction with genealogical databases, maximizing privacy and security. So I've looked into several cases, and sometimes you will hear family members that are commenting about, they're asking us to do a test, but I don't want to put my DNA in a database, in a publicly available database. Basically, KinSNP is going around that. They're saying, look, just give it to us. We will process it in our lab. That information is going to be safe there. No one else is ever going to have access to it. It's not going to become part of GEDmatch or, 23andMe or any of those databases. This is specifically for the purpose of seeing, are you the person related to this case? Which is great. And we could see just with the turnaround, they processed. Not only did they process it, got the answer, got it back to law enforcement contacted the family. Like, that whole process happened within a month. It's amazing. KinSNP accelerates the investigative process while maximizing privacy protections for voluntary target testers. And not only because the results are not entered into a genealogy database, said David Middleman, he's the CEO. When target tests take months, investigators are compelled to test several potential relatives in parallel. But if it's quicker, the test can be done in series. So effectively what he's saying is, because typical tests take so long, an investigator is going to say, well, let's go ahead and run 5 or 6 of these. Let's go collect all those samples, kick off all those tests, get that started, and think not just about cost, but how often are we hearing in cases about, the DNA testing's taking so long because labs are backed up? This is helping with that because the turnaround time on this is so short, they don't have to do that grab bag of, we're going to run 6 or 7 tests all at the same time. They're basically going to say, let's run this one test. We'll let you guys know in a short time. And then if that's not the person, here's the next person on the list. We can go to that next person. So to David's point here, it leads to fewer tests overall to get a solve. And it was recently used to confirm relationships in the widely covered case of Mostly Harmless, a case that I know most of you know about. We spoke about it here on the channel and on the podcast. So obviously, there is a very human element to this story that we've been missing so far. We've looked at kind of the technical details. We've looked at the original case details of Judy Doe being found. We now know that's Rebecca Sue Hill. But what about the family? What are they going through in all this? What a roller coaster. I mean, can you imagine that you assume this is a closed matter for 40 years, and then all of a sudden your phone rings and an investigator is telling you maybe not? I can't believe going through that. But a big thank you to Arkansas Online for the Arkansas Democrat Gazette for really digging in here. They're pretty much the only people I've seen. I've seen one other news agency that has spoken to a family member, but not nearly to this level of depth. So my hat's off to the Democrat Gazette and specifically Daniel McFadden, who did a great job on this. In mid-1981, 17-year-old Eddie Hill was going into the Army. Hill's family, his father Edwin, stepmother Dolores, stepbrother David, and younger sister, 16-year-old Rebecca Sue Hill, traveled from their home in Austin, Arkansas to Little Rock, where they would see him off for Fort Benning in Georgia. Not among them was Hill's older sister, Stacy Strickland, who had moved away earlier that year when she got married. Quote, "She was a little petite thing, joyful," Hill recalled of his sister, who had reddish brown hair, his younger sister, obviously, Rebecca. "She was a good girl. She wasn't a troublemaker or anything when we were little. She was a good, loving person." But Hill said he and his siblings didn't have a real good life as kids. "My aunt was talking about it with me the other night, and she says, 'I remember you kids getting whippings for anything.' You got a whipping just for not taking the trash out," Hill said. "I don't know if you want to say child abuse or what. If we didn't do something right away, we got smacked or got a whipping." So one thing that kind of sticks out to me is the description that we heard about Judy Doe's ribs being fractured or broken and then healed when she was alive. With what he's talking about here, I don't know if that could have potentially happened in terms of her home life. It just makes me wonder about it because even he seems to not really understand. I don't know if this was child abuse or not. Now, the descriptions that he's giving us wouldn't necessarily lead me to believe that. Maybe they happened after that, but it is something that's certainly floating around for me. Hill remembers what Rebecca whispered in his ear when she gave him a goodbye hug. Last time he saw her, he's heading off to the Army. She says, "Please don't leave me alone." That was the last time that he saw Rebecca. So their older sister, Strickland, wasn't close with Rebecca when they were growing up. "There's things from our childhood that kind of prevented that," Strickland said. They don't go into a whole lot of detail on this stuff, but she remembers a girl who was quiet and always sat and watched me if I had a date or something. She liked to sing like Dad did. She was really good at it. Rebecca didn't have many friends. Her sister continues that they always lived out in the country, so that kind of made it hard. When she was young, Rebecca always ran really high fevers, which resulted in her being a little slow, according to her older sister. She wasn't stupid, but she was slow and she was trustworthy of anybody, she said. Becky just wanted to fit in as normal, and people, unfortunately, took advantage of that. Strickland remembers the last time she saw her sister in the summer of 1981. She recalled Rebecca being very sad. "That had to be due to my stepmom, I'm sure," Strickland said. "She didn't know what to do. I could tell she felt like she didn't fit in." After that summer, Strickland received discouraging news from Edwin and Dolores. They said that someone had been prostituting her little sister. According to what Strickland said, she remembers the family had gotten a call from a police department telling them a detective had found Rebecca at a truck stop. So we are now talking about some form of trafficking. Could that be a reasonable explanation for some of the other injuries, the ribs noted on her body? Possibly. Could it also be an explanation for how she wound up? Her family's in Arkansas. Her body is found in Florida. How would a 16 or 17-year-old get there? And, we know she's alive for a matter of years after this. What is going on? What's happening to her in that time? Also really troubling to think about. Christmas 1981, Eddie Hill came home from Fort Benning for the holidays. Edwin told his son that Rebecca was missing. So Eddie gets home. His dad, Edwin, tells him that Rebecca is missing. She was assumed to be in Little Rock. Armed with a photo of Rebecca, Eddie walked the streets of downtown Little Rock in the hours after midnight, asking if anyone recognized his sister. No one did. Obviously, we have him knowing the story of what was going on with her, and he hit the streets with her picture trying to find her. Hill doesn't know exactly when his sister disappeared. There are conflicting stories about from where Rebecca vanished. Hill said his aunt remembers her going to stay with grandparents in Leslie, which is in White County, and she supposedly got up one morning to go to school and didn't come home. Hill said that the family submitted a missing persons report, but no one remembers what agency that they went to. I didn't go into all the details here, but basically, as they were doing their research for this story, they went and tried to confirm all of these law enforcement touches, and none of them are confirmed. But we know that some of them had to happen because this case did get closed out because of this conclusion about the remains that someone made. Wherever Rebecca disappeared from, Hill lamented, "I feel like I let her down, not being there to protect her." Sometime later, Edwin received a call from a detective. They're noting here that he seems to recall it being Little Rock Police Department, but that department has no record of anything related to Rebecca. And that's not out of the realm of possibility for me when we're talking about records this old. We run into situations where that thing happens all the time here on the channel as we're looking into these cases. The detective told Edwin that they found a girl's body in a farmer's field there in Little Rock somewhere, and they wanted us to come and identify. So Eddie, his father Edwin, and stepmother Dolores went to the law enforcement agency and were presented with a clay recreation of a female skull, along with clothes that had been found with the body. It kind of looked like me, Eddie said, her brother. Me and Rebecca, when we were kids, we would pass as twins. The detective asked Edwin if the skull was Rebecca's. My dad did not identify her, Eddie said. He said it looked like her. So we talked to the detective a little bit and everything, and we went home. Needless to say, nothing had been said anymore to us about it. We figured it was still under investigation. The older sister, Strickland, would recall her father showing her a photo of the clay reconstruction. She had a different take on it. I didn't think it was her. I didn't think it looked like her at all, she said. I kept telling Dad that that was not Becky, and he insisted that it looks just like her. I'm like, no, it does not. That's something else I'm kind of, I'm almost at odds with in some way. The digital recreation here, now that we know who she actually is, the digital recreation is not great. And honestly, I don't know that I've ever seen a clay recreation that was so solid. Look at the facial features here. And look at the facial features in a photo of her. They've just, the clay recreation is really, really well done. And I would think that, if a family member saw this clay recreation, I would think that they would call it out and say, yeah, that looks like her. To think that there was another recreation done of some other young woman, and that's what they're looking at and thinking, is this her or not? Yeah, I think it's her. I wish we could see a photo of that. I want to see that as well. Obviously, there is a photo of it. So we have some members of the family thinking, case closed, we know where she is. And we have one member, her older sister, saying, nope, I don't think so. As a matter of fact, for years, Strickland kept her Facebook profile wide open for people to access, but it was really for Rebecca. Quote, I was always hoping that she'd get a hold of me through Facebook or something. So her sister was waiting for a Facebook message or a phone call. She does get a phone call in late 2024, but not from her sister, unfortunately, from a detective by the name of Williams. He basically tells her that if she submits her DNA, she could possibly find out what happened to her younger sister 4 decades ago. However, her initial reaction after talking to Williams was one of worry. I kind of had a feeling. I figured it was Becky, Strickland said. I've been waiting for years to hear a phone call or something from somebody. When the test arrived, Strickland did it right away, and then it seemed like it took forever for them to be able to match up the genealogy. That's pretty interesting, because we were just talking about like a 1 month turnaround on that. Seems pretty quick. And at this point, it wouldn't be necessarily like a genealogy research job to have happened. That work would have been done already for them to identify her. So this is literally that one particular test where it's a person-to-person match. Around Christmas, Williams called her and let her know that it was a 100% match. I was surprised she was in Florida, Strickland said. I don't know how she got there. To find out she died that way, I really feel bad for her, her sister added. She didn't get much of a chance at life at all. Of course, for their brother Eddie, the news about his sister was like being kicked in the stomach. So he had that different belief, right? He thought, we know where she is, and he put that away 40 years ago, and then it became unwrapped in his lap. All I can hear her say is, please don't leave me. Strickland said her brothers are discussing what to do about Rebecca's remains, which are buried in Lone Oak Cemetery in Leesburg, about 35 minutes southwest of where she was found at Lake Door. And I'm just hoping, seeing how her remains were treated, that they were actually buried somewhere. Fingers crossed that the person they thought was her, maybe they've been buried somewhere too. Maybe that case can continue to be processed. Among the possibilities is having her brought to Mayflower, where the Hill family has burial plots. We're upset that she's not here, but we can lay her to rest now and lay her in peace, Eddie Hill said. And then we have Zachary Williams, the detective working this case. Quote from him, "It takes my breath away just thinking about it." I'm sure it does. I've got a little more from here I want to listen to. Let's run this together from WESH News.
It was their father that identified the remains, although the rest of the family didn't agree. More than likely, it was just for closure for the family, kind of move on to the next chapter. Speaking with the family and giving them that little bit of closure that, in this case, they didn't know that they needed. It's been a phenomenal experience.
So I've seen the comments, I've seen people asking the question, like, who made the identification? According to Eddie, the father said, yeah, it could be her, but Eddie is saying, at least in that time when they were first being presented with this in the detective's office, he did not make a solid identification. I don't know if maybe that happened later. Maybe there was some kind of phone call with the detective and the father, and he was asking, hey, can we close this out? Do you think that it's her? Because it seems like the father's belief was certainly strong that way. But here we have, Detective Williams telling us it was the father that made that confirmed identification. So one way or another, it almost makes me think, shouldn't there be some form of documentation, some kind of, shouldn't it be taken as a statement, something that's signed and actually notarized and added to part of an official record somewhere? I'm sure that would have prompted a death certificate to be created for her. So shouldn't there be some accompanying paperwork that kind of makes that happen? There might be. I'm not running into any details about that here. Williams also said, so many detectives have put so much effort into this. I was in a fortunate enough position to push this closer to the finish line. And I love that, because it's really showing you the truth of these cases. I think there's a lot of times where, because we're so used to watching fictionalized shows about this kind of stuff, we really try to credit one person in particular for solving it. And he's pointing out, hey, look, there's a bunch of different detectives that worked on this. I was just the guy in the seat for this last push. I know he appreciates Othram's work and involvement on this as well. It's a team when it comes to this stuff. And I love that he's taken that, because he's got the lights, he's got the camera on him at this point, and he doesn't think about taking all the glory. He thinks about giving credit to all the people that worked on this, which I really appreciate. So we have the older sister that knew the whole time, didn't believe the story, thought that Rebecca was out there somewhere just waiting to hear from her. We had the younger brother, Eddie, thought this was a closed case. All of that gets upended. And now we've got this big question of who's responsible for doing this to her. Over at WFTV9, for Rebecca's surviving brother and sister, the break in this case has stirred up mixed emotions, since they believed Rebecca had been found years ago. Rebecca's brother Eddie said he was extremely grateful to Lake County detectives and believed there could soon be answers to unresolved questions, including who murdered Rebecca and how she ended up in Lake County. After 40 years, we never thought we'd find out what happened to her, said Eddie Hill. We're very hopeful we'll get some answers. And it's interesting because you had these investigations still going on, right? So even before they identified who Judy Doe was, there was still an investigation going on in terms of trying to figure out who might have done something to that body that was found in the woods. And outside of all that, we have a member of the media maybe overstep what some people might call lines of journalistic integrity because he's trying to do the right thing. And he basically reaches out to some governors in particular, asking for some special considerations to give them the answer to several cases, including this one. And that was going on almost 20 years ago. And of course, it's from, when it comes to television coverage, who I consider the best of the best. It's a producer for Dateline. Let's learn about these developments here. TV producer says suspect will talk if death penalty waived. A producer for the television show Dateline NBC has offered the governors of Texas and Florida a deal, waive the death penalty for a murder suspect, and he'll help solve 3 murder cases in their states. Producer Shane Bishop offered the deal, and that was for an Arkansas convict serving life without parole for murder. So this guy, he's already sitting in jail. He's not going anywhere. But he's not going to admit to these things, basically, unless they take the death penalty off the table. Michael Roning has admitted to me that he has committed a total of 7 murders, Bishop wrote. Why am I writing you? To beg that you take up this effort? Because it's the right thing to do. But I'm certain Dateline NBC would give substantial coverage to the solving of these 3 cold case murders tied to a serial killer and the essential roles played by the governors of Texas and Florida. Bishop said that Roning didn't know that he was writing the letter. By the way, I like that he is basically trying to use his position to get these governors to like, hey, look, this is going to be a good pat on the back for you guys if we can make this happen. But he's not doing this in an official capacity for Dateline, and he's not even doing this in any capacity for Roning. He doesn't know about it. Bishop said that he's been a producer for Dateline for 12 years. Bishop said Roning passed a polygraph and gave statements in which he admitted committing the murders in Michigan, but he was never charged. Instead, prosecutors there labeled him as a liar and sent back to serve out the rest of his life sentence in Arkansas, Bishop wrote. In his letter, Bishop said that he interviewed Roning for a Dateline NBC broadcast in 2002. And in an interesting offshoot on this, some of the murders that he's admitting to, they have someone else, or had someone else, sitting in jail for them. Thomas Kress. Tom Kress, a man of diminished mental capacity, was wrongfully convicted of a rape and murder that occurred in 1983 in Battle Creek, Michigan. So basically, we have all this stuff going, and he wasn't released until 2010. So about 4 years before, we have this confession coming in from another guy that's suspected of being a serial killer. He's only officially charged for 1 murder. But here at Murderpedia, we can see number of victims, 1 to 7 is what they're giving him here. He basically admits to murders that this other guy's serving time for. That legal team tries to file some appeals, and there's this crazy story about the DNA for that case being destroyed after that case was tried. Basically, they got their conviction and then, go ahead and destroy all that stuff. So they couldn't retest any DNA, and basically that appeal could not move forward. Then we have a form of Innocence Project that kind of takes up the case. And, typically with Innocence Projects, you hear about them being so DNA focused. This helped start a non-DNA Innocence Project. So where that expertise was geared for a different type of case. So thankfully, Thomas Kress would get released. But what about Michael? So They have him classified as a murderer with characteristics of rape. His date of murder is from 1982 to 1986. And the victim that he was incarcerated for is Diana Lynn Hanley, who was 19 years old, stabbed. They also note his locations of operation as Arkansas, Michigan, Texas, and Florida. 2 of those states are right from this story. Sentenced to life in prison without parole in Arkansas. So when that Dateline letter gets sent, I'm also curious about how that information became public. There's some agencies that are saying that they effectively filed an Information Act request to get a copy of that letter, but I wonder how it originally broke. Like, how would they know to even go ask for that letter? So I think that was almost another attempt on someone's behalf to try to push this thing forward. But there's a run of articles that happen off of that, and they are tying Michael Ronning with this particular case. Suspect emerges in killing, but an admitted murderer in Arkansas refuses to talk about it. Lake County investigators suspect an admitted serial killer serving life in an Arkansas prison may know something about the case, but Michael Ronning, 48, isn't talking. Today, Ronning is serving life in prison without parole for the 1986 murder of a 19-year-old woman in Jonesboro, Arkansas. He has admitted to at least 6 other killings, 3 in Michigan, 2 in Texas, and 1 in Florida, but authorities have never charged him in those homicides. These victims and their deaths share similarities. They were all young women, and their bodies were found in woods close to where Ronning lived. So we know from his one conviction that was a stabbing. We don't really have solid details in terms of what happened to Rebecca's body, so we don't know if that might have been the same method or a different method. Continuing at the Orlando Sentinel, Williams said he's trying to confirm Ronning's involvement in Hill's death, and if he finds evidence directly linking him, he intends to have prosecutors close the case despite having no one alive to prosecute. So this current detective, he thinks that there is some possibility that this is the right guy for this. And he needs to find the evidence that actually proves that. In terms of DNA evidence, with the state that body was in, that's probably not going to be a strong method. Was anything else found with the body or anything else found in the area that might have DNA? Like if there was a weapon used, was that found? We do know some clothing. Clothing's found. Could that be possibly tested 40 years later? We know they can take a shot at it. But he continues here, if the state attorney's office is in agreement with the charges and the evidence surrounding the case, then we typically get a letter from the state saying that, yes, we do believe that Michael Ronning committed this crime, or whoever, depending on the case, he said. And then that allows us to close that case exceptionally as the suspect's deceased. Yeah, unfortunately, this isn't something where they can go and ask Michael about this now. He did die in prison about 3 years ago, 2022. So it leaves a bit of a loose end there. So if he is the person, then I really hope this evidence comes in and they're able to close that out officially and get that information back to the family, and then they can truly put this at rest. But of course, we're left with this other issue now, as we're seeing from Sims Guy 67 here on Web Sleuths. I'm quite curious on who the remains misidentified as belonging to Rebecca really were. Did they even belong to a teenage girl? I feel like this ID has opened a whole other can of worms aside from Rebecca's murder. And of course, that brought me back to NamUs. So I kind of set up a search at NamUs, looking particularly in Arkansas, I just wanted to thin the search out a little bit. That's where the body was found. I wanted to see if there was any missing person profiles that fit that. So this has also been thinned down to anyone whose date of last contact is before April 18th of 1984. Unfortunately, there's a lot of these you can rule out quite easily. This woman's 65 years old, date of last contact, 1957 at that time. It's definitely not her. We do know that sometimes those age ranges can slip around. They're estimates. The other thing to keep in mind is there could be a gap between where they go missing and then whatever happens to them there, like was the reality of that case with Rebecca. We know that she went missing back in 1981. That body's found in 1984. and they estimated death within 2 to 4 weeks of when it's found. So there was 3 years that she was floating around out there. So you have to kind of parallel all that information as you're looking at these records. But honestly, an 18-year-old in 1975, that's not going to match up. A 25-year-old in 1978, probably not going to match up. A 38-year-old in 78, not going to match up. None of these are really great matches. Linda Reynolds is a little interesting. Date of last contact is May 1982. At the age of 30, that would have made her 32. Could they slip the age range by a decade? We have seen that. We have seen that happen in cases, but usually when it's fully skeletonized remains. Of course, they also have clothing description. I don't know if we have a clothing description on her for last seen, but let's see here. According to mother Nancy Reynolds, her daughter Linda went out the night before, but came back home and left a note saying that she was staying with friends and she'd be back home in time to go to work, but has not returned. The only belongings she has is her purse. Strawberry blonde hair, hazel eyes, strawberry blonde and light brown hair. That could definitely be something that gets confused. We got no other information for anything here. I don't think it's a super strong match. And, this is limited to just missing persons cases in Arkansas in particular for that time frame that could fit this mystery woman. She might have been from another state. I mean, if Rebecca's case is informing us in all these different ways, it's also teaching us that. I mean, this is a 16 or 17-year-old that, her older sister thought that she was slow, and she winds up in a trafficking situation. Also, to call out, she was found at the bus stop where she was prostituting. So for her to ask for a ride from someone, for her to all of a sudden travel and go interstate, very strong with the conditions that we know were happening in her life before that, her ability to do that. So, for this case, it really comes down to two things. Number one, are they right about Ronning? Is he the guy? And if they are, can they firm that up and really close this whole case out? Thankfully, they've identified the remains. Thankfully, the family will be bringing them home. There could be a proper memorial in the right place, and let them grieve that loss properly. But then we've got this whole other X factor with this complete other mystery. And who knows if the right missing persons profile is in NamUs. These are records, from the early 1980s that are having to be looked at. And in terms of putting records into a database system, in most situations, you're going to get the most current records in there first, and then the backlog will be, okay, let's get to those older ones later. And that's only if the particular state that this mystery girl went missing from has some legislation that's going to effectively ask or force law enforcement to do that, or if that record is lucky enough to be in a department where you've got some forward-thinking detective who's saying, you know what, we're going to spend time or we're going to spend resources and we're going to get all these records into that database. This is like the perfect case for demonstrating how important that is. So if you do see legislation, there's legislation that pops up occasionally in all the states. I know we've got a number, I think there's a few dozen states now that have some form of legislation about getting these records into NamUs. If you see something like that's happening in your state, please support those efforts. It's such a simple premise in terms of a tool. Get all these records in that one place, and then they can do the work to match them up. But it only works if all the records are in there. And this case is a perfect example of that. This case, also a perfect example of how even a simple system can be thwarted by an incorrect conclusion that has basically unraveled one case that was thought to be solved and now created another one that no one even knew about. It's really just mind-bending. What do you guys think? Let's talk about it in the comments down below. Thank you so much for supporting us here on the Lord and Arts channel. We can't do it without our amazing supporters, especially with the limited commercials that we have always featured for the past 10 years. Speaking of 10 years, The next episode of Brain Scratch is going to be a bit of a retrospective. I hope you'll join me for that in 2 weeks. If you would like to become a supporter, please visit lordandarts.com. There you can sign up for Patreon, sign up for PayPal, buy merchandise, or even just buy us a coffee. We really appreciate it. Take care, everyone. Stay safe. Please join us again next week for another episode. It'll be a Searchlight next week, right here on the Lord and Arts channel.